And now we're going to get into Megan Mcardle, who is sort of a famous columnist in the Chapo universe that people might be familiar with.
Never remind someone of a better show, Giordano.
So just to give you a little scoop on Megan Mcardle, if you're not familiar with her, she's a columnist. She's like a famous 2000 style libertarian who wrote a blog under the pseudonym Jane Galt, which is a character from Ayn Rand.
The Fountainhead.
From the Fountainhead. And she's from New York City. She lived with her parents until she was 30 or something and just posted endlessly until she got a job working for The Economist. And she's sort of legendary for her takes because she's so prolific, but in a way that isn't even impressive, because she worked for The Atlantic for 5 years. And in those 5 years, I counted the number of articles that she wrote, and it's in the thousands.
Mm-hmm.
Always be posting.
At first, I was like, wow, she wrote 6,000 political articles in 5 years. That's incredible. And then it occurred to me that in order to post that much, how much thought are you really putting into these? She's like diarrheaing on the internet.
I just want to put this classic joke about Ayn Rand on the recording. There are two novels that can change a bookish 14-year-old's life: The Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged. One is a childish fantasy that often engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood, unable to deal with the real world. The other, of course, involves orcs. Got their ass.
Coded in narco-primitive text, J.R.R. Tolkien, like deindustrialized Britain. Liz Truss, you're working on it. We see you there.
Yeah, J.R.R. Tolkien is actually the best evidence for not going to therapy. The guy claimed he hated metaphors. It's like, no, Mordor is not a metaphor for the Western Front. It's just a mythological story about orcs. And it's like, well, or, it's like a desiccated, burnt out landscape where nothing can grow and war has happened. So, I'm just glad he worked through his trauma by writing these novels instead of talking about his childhood with a therapist. I think the world is a better place because J.R.R. Tolkien didn't go to therapy. That's a spicy Megan Mgriddle style take. But
I mean, Megan Mcardle is famous for her libertarian views. She loves to claim that, she wrote a book called The Upside of Down. And her whole thing is, the thing that you actually think is bad is good because of the after effects. And so we're going to read a couple articles from her in 2003 in the lead up to the Iraq War, where much like Joe Scarborough, she's basically just bullying people into going to war. This is the first article that we're going to read. We're doing a little reading series on this podcast. This is the first ever. And it's an article that Megan wrote in support of the war. And it's in just the sickest terms imaginable. It's titled, "How Much is the War Going to Cost?" This is Megan Mcardle theorizing about how much the war is going to cost. Specifically, she's making fun of someone who is estimating that the war is going to be very expensive. So, okay, this is quoting Megan. "I've seen a number of claims like this one from Eric Alterman. The first 75 billion is just the down payment. Expect to pay hundreds of billions in the short term, trillions in the long run. Expect it to come out of your schools, your police forces, your highways, your future, and your children's future." This is Megan, quoting someone. And then this is her clapback. "Trillions? US GDP is roughly 10 trillion. Alterman is saying that over the long run, this war is going to cost us at least 20% of GDP. That's nuts. It's not the first time I've seen those sorts of numbers around. Reality check. The entire US military budget is in the range of $350 billion. Saying this war will cost trillions in any short term for us to care about is saying that this war is going to cost nearly as much as the entire military budget year in, year out for decades. For reference, the next 6 months are estimated to cost $60 billion in military spending. Even with a fudge factor of 50%, that's $90 billion over the next 6 months, $180 billion a year. At that rate, assuming you do absolutely no discounting at all, it would take us over 10 years to get to $2 trillion, thus meeting the trillions criteria, which is madness. Yeah, just to summarize what we're doing here, this is Megan Mcardle in the lead up to the Iraq War saying that the idea that the war could cost $2 trillion is laughable. Do you want to know how much the war ended up costing in Iraq? Exactly $2 trillion. So she's saying that this person's idea is laughable, it's a fantasy, and they were like Nostradamus, just bullseyeing the number 15 years before the war was over. And by the way, that $2 trillion is what's generally agreed upon to be like the lower estimate of how much the war costs.
So I just want to harp on this number for a couple of reasons, because I think this is why y'all brought me here today. I did some digging on this. I remember some friends getting me the book, The $3 Trillion War by Joseph Stiglitz in 2008. And this is from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 2013. The staggering financial cost of the Iraq War can continue to rise even a decade later. Initially justified as a war that would cost about 50 to 60 billion, today experts estimate that the true financial cost is between 4 and 6 trillion. In order to understand the war's rising price tag, Linda J. Blimes, author of the 2008 book, The $3 Trillion War, who co-authored it with Joseph Stiglitz, explained how her research team arrived at these numbers, and as it's published in her book, she discovered that at least 2 trillion to more than 3 trillion figure would be taking into account rising disability benefits for veterans and claims by returning veterans, as well as equipment attrition. So basically, that's them saying that the amortization of the U.S. military equipment and kind of life cycle cost of this shit was just not accounted in anyone's numbers. As again, I'm sure Megan Mcardle could tell you about anyone doing the civil service budget. This is just so funny because this is from 9 years ago now, and literally we're already talking about 4 to 6 trillion. I've seen 10 trillion batted around Afghanistan and Iraq combined. And also keep in mind the Pentagon has never been fully audited. So yeah, these are all wonderful data points.
Someone should maybe get on that. I know the budget that we know about that they passed is $750-something billion a year. And I know that some conservative voices, like Tucker Carlson, I believe, would point out to you that even though Joe Biden raised it to, I believe, almost $800 billion a year, factoring in inflation, Joe Biden actually cut the military budget, making us unsafe.
Again, you gotta respect Megan Mcardle for when you're quoting someone who literally predicts the thing that is correct and then shading them in the next line. The shamelessness, you gotta recognize it. Before TikTok, there was Meg.
Yeah. How aggressively wrong she was.
And just a reminder, this woman now works for the Washington Post. Was she punished for being so wrong? No. In fact, she was given one of the cushiest jobs in media for a liberal organization.
Okay, this is quoting Megan again.
Where do they get these numbers? With gems like this from James Galbraith, the son of the amiably paranoiac pop economist John Kenneth Galbraith. I love that she calls John Kenneth Galbraith a pop economist. And it's like, what the fuck do you do, Megan? Like, you have a BA in English literature and you feel justified enough in commenting on this, but John Kenneth Galbraith, who's written like 50 books on economics, isn't qualified to talk about it. Yet somehow you are quoting James Galbraith, the son of the pop economist John Kenneth Galbraith. Recently, as we've debated the war now underway in Iraq, 7 Nobel laureates joined with 150 other U.S. economists, including myself, to call for careful consideration of the cost of the war in Iraq. When economists talk about costs, what do we mean? First, we mean budget costs for gasoline, equipment, and explosives that begin about $100 billion. This figure is based on the assumption that the war goes well. The assumption is wrong. The numbers will go up fast. The history of warfare from Europe in 1914 to Vietnam in the 1960s is littered with gross underestimates of budget costs. In Iraq, though, the civilian population is already stressed. Even modest material damage to the water, to the electrical grids, and to the health system could all bring on a humanitarian disaster. There are risks of sabotage, not least to the oil fields, and there will be some damage inevitably to the archaeological heritage of Iraq and especially Baghdad. The human costs are beyond understanding. No matter the number of casualties, every dead soldier on either side is a dead civilian, is a human being who could have lived a productive and perhaps happy life. Every injured person will carry a burden of pain. We need not demean the grief ahead by trying to give it a money value. The reconstruction costs are imponderable. One estimate for the cost of rebuilding Iraq runs $2 trillion. So this is Megan's clapback. She's quoting him in that section there. She says, he conflates all sorts of costs into one big amorphous bundle. He only looks at costs on one side. For example, discussing the costs of lives in the war without discussing the costs of lives in Saddam's regime and the sanctions that are likely alternative to war.
Does it cost America money?
If we kill 300 Iraqi civilians and 300 American troops ousting Saddam, and Saddam's secret police are murdering 1,000 people a year, and 5,000 people a year are dying from humanitarian crisis brought on by sanctions, it is not a net cost in human lives.
Who's doing the sanctions?
Yeah.
We're going to save the starving children. And why are they starving? Who's starving them? You're starving them.
The other thing she's doing here is she's complaining about an economist adding up costs. Isn't that what fucking economists do?
Yeah, I love also the idea that when planning for the cost of the war, they're like, well, this is the cost if everything goes well. That's what you want. That's how I like to plan my life. If everything goes perfect for the next year, then we'll be fine.
But think about Megan Mcardle's own experience. She's been on a roll for 25 years. I mean, like, literally, she was living with her parents in a cushy Manhattan apartment, got to pretend to be an erudite American in London, always be sus of Americans in London, and then fails up to the Atlantic in WAPO. It's like, how couldn't Schwarzenegger think he could bang his maid? She's been on a roll for 30 years, boys.
That's a classic Megan Mcardle Upper West Side shuffle, to be like, oh, well, let's say, the people who are dying from Saddam's secret police is 1,000 people a year. And you have to count that against the people who are dying from war, which let's just say ballpark 300 people a year. Like just some very Lucille Bluth style estimations of the number of people who are going to die from war at 300, as if they would ever be comparable.
Yeah, what pisses me off so much about the pro-war argument that's like Saddam is so wickedly evil. George H.W. Bush said he could have been the next Hitler in the Middle East. Listen, I'm not going to be a fucking Saddam defender or apologist. Yeah, it was a bad dude. You know who didn't think he was a bad dude? America for like 20 years, from 20-ish, from like 1979-ish to the early 90s. There's a photo of Donald Rumsfeld shaking his hand. He got the key to the city of Detroit. He was their boy for a long, long time until he wasn't. Yeah, you can talk about how wickedly evil he is, but America did do a heck of a lot to enable him. So it rings very hollow.
I mean, one step further, even before Saddam, the whole Ba'athist movement in Syria was mostly because the Baathists were anti-communist, right? Mm-hmm. The American meddling in the Middle East is always convenience. If you want to talk about bad dictators, we're supporting a theocratic monarchy that only controls 7% of the global oil supply to do war crimes in Yemen because it makes money.
Yeah. You know what? You guys aren't thinking enough about the butterfly effect of invading Iraq, because Megan has some really good points that I want to bring up.
Oh, yeah, hit me.
When she says, likewise, he examines only the negative consequences the current uncertainty might have on the economy, without mentioning, for example, that a successful war might boost the consumer confidence, dampened by fears of terrorism, or that lowered security risk in the Middle East might result in both lower oil prices and higher investment in highly oil-dependent industries. So you guys aren't considering, one, the boost in consumer confidence that comes from declaring war, and two, that we're going to have a more stable Middle East after we're done with this.
Why aren't people shopping more? Is it because wages have been stagnant since the 70s? No, people aren't shopping enough because they're scared of terrorism. They're scared if they go to the mall, they'll get 9/11s.
And historically, going to war, a very stabilizing thing.
Yeah.
People aren't thinking about that,
Yeah, people haven't thought about it. Remember, America went into Vietnam, and look what happened to its neighbors, Laos and Cambodia. they just did splendidly.
All right, so getting back to Megan Mgriddle here. He offers unsourced references for large numbers. One estimate for the cost of rebuilding Iraq runs $2 trillion in order to give his false claims a patina of precision. She's criticizing this man for giving unsourced cost numbers when he's sourcing 150 economists, and she's doing nothing. She's just shitting words out onto her stupid blog.
All of her benefits are equally unsourced. Sorry, where is the economic law that wars boost consumer confidence or stability? Or what have you? Say what you will about the economists. I do think it's a fake field that shouldn't exist, but they at least can point to things and count things. Things do have costs. If this is essentially an adding exercise, it's something I think we can trust the economists with. But her entire benefits are entirely nebulous and hypothetical and amorphous.
Yeah, getting back to Megan, you can't claim that our failure to institute national health care is an opportunity cost of the war, when such a thing would cost far more than the money being spent on war, and when it's something we probably wouldn't be doing anyway. Well, she is right about that second. But you want to talk about unsourced facts. Forget about the fact that most economists, including a Koch-funded study, have said that Medicare for All would actually save $2 trillion over a 10-year period.
Yeah, it would be more efficient. But yeah, never forget, dear listener, that when Barack Obama could have done single-payer healthcare, he is on the record saying that he can't do it because it would destroy 3 million jobs. And those jobs are those bureaucrats that stop you from seeing a doctor.
Think of the Billings consultants. Think of the Billings consultants, man.
Someone please think of the Billings consultants.
Yeah, every time someone's like, oh, you need to send me another photocopy of your insurance card, that's a job Obama saved so that you wouldn't have health care.
I'll just finish up this article. That the cost to U.S. taxpayers will be over $2 trillion, even though most of the larger costs cited by Galbraith aren't going to be borne by Americans, either directly or indirectly, but by Iraqi oil. That's the oil that will be able to flow freely for the first time in 10 years because of this war, and the revenue from which will flow.
You could stop the sanctions at any time. You could just stop them. That's it.
Am I suggesting that the Iraqis should pay for occupation expenses? Nope. We can afford it. And there's something repellent about making impoverished Iraqis pay for a war foisted on them by an evil dictator.
So good you clarified that after
Shut the fuck up! Sorry, who's foisting the war now?
Housing stock.
Yeah, this is Saddam foisting the war on them. Let's not forget that.
Why'd you make me hit you? Why'd you make me hit you? Why'd you make me hit you?
Back to Megan.
The war will certainly cost more than the $60 billion in change that the president is asking for, but it is not going to run us several $1 trillion. Though even if it did, that would work out to less than 0.1% of GDP over the next 20 years. I love that when you float a number like $60 billion to a libertarian for healthcare, it's something that can't be done. And yet, if it's for a war, it's like, you know what? It's pocket change over the next 20 years.
Also, I love how Megan Mgriddle is far more cold and calculating and just robotic and non-human like than the fucking Economist. The passage of the Economist you quoted, even he's like, oh yeah, there's all this cultural heritage in Iraq, you know, the earliest cities of Mesopotamia. Such important data points for how humanity transferred from being fucking hunter-gatherers to civilized people. And it's all going to get fucking wrecked by this war.
And it was.
And it was. And that Economist is also, never mind the human cost, just not even part of Megan Mcardle's fucking calculus at all.
That's what links a lot of Megan's articles together is whenever she talks about support for the war, not only is it wrong, but it's in the most inhuman terms. It's always the reason why we should go to war is because it's a good deal.
Yeah. We can't leave this money on the table.
The only reason why you wouldn't do it is because it's expensive, you know?
Yeah.
It's war. I got a discount going on. I got a guy selling me some Humvees at a 3% discount off a hot lot. We're going to do this quickly. Get some Blackwater in there, you know, sub some of this out, reduce the net costs. It'll be great.
Closing thoughts on costs in the military here. I think everyone should read Naomi Klein's shock doctrine because she talks about how the day before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld made a speech at the Pentagon about how the greatest national security threat facing America was the Pentagon's bloated bureaucracy. So what Bush and them did is they massively increased the Pentagon's budget while slashing their internal fucking bureaucracy. So the Pentagon used to run its own mail. The Pentagon used to do its own food. The Pentagon used to run all of this stuff internally because it's the fucking military. It's not supposed to be based on efficiencies or profit. It's supposed to be based off of fucking security. So it turned into a giant money laundering thing where most of the military started being run by subcontractors and subcontractors so that everyone could get their beak wet in war.
You know, Dick Cheney specifically, he had a $19 million bonus, I believe, when he left Halliburton in order to take the job and run for vice president. This is an oil field services and logistics company, right? And for those people who are listening who don't know what that tacitly means, it's moving people and shit to fuel things around, which obviously will immensely benefit from a war in an oil-producing country. So I'm not going to be conspiratorial in saying this was all for money, but there was certainly a map that existed of Iraq in the White House where people had designs on what the oil industry would look like after Iraq. And just Megan Mcardle so casually being like, oh, it's a good get is, you know.
Yeah, I looked into it. This claim that we paid for the war via the oil that was freed up, false, basically. Turns out getting oil out of an active war zone, more difficult than people imagine.
But what's important is that under Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi oil industry was nationalized among a whole host of other industries. And early on in the occupation, all that shit was privatized, much like happened in Russia in the early 90s. They sold that shit off for pennies to various and sundry international businesses. But we're getting far from Megan.
This is the last line of this article. How much is the war going to cost? Okay. Mm-hmm. But making up ridiculous numbers in order to support your predisposition isn't helpful. And when the war doesn't cost us $2 trillion, people are going to remember that that the next time you talk about the cost of a program you don't like. Well, I guess she was wrong on two fronts. One is with that the war cost more than $2 trillion, and also that people are going to remember it.
Yep.
I have a couple more choice cuts from Megan. This is her posting after played that clip before on the show of Michael Moore getting booed at the Academy Awards, but this is her post after that event. Michael Moore predictably won the Oscar for Bowling for Columbine. Utterly predictable. He made an anti-Bush, anti-war speech. Highly unpredictable, the boos were louder than the applause. It's clear that Michael Moore, for all his blather, thought that he was taking a most uncourageous stand, preaching to the choir. The people who booed, given where they live and work, that took guts. I suspect we won't see any more brave anti-war stances tonight, now that it's become clear that actual courage is involved.
I love it. People aren't praised enough for the courage of being part of a mob.
Her stance there is that Michael Moore, he was pandering. Actually, you know who was courageous? The mob for booing him. I have another article that I want to read through, which is about why the war is going to be good for the economy. Because Megan has a really big brain take on this. Okay. So essentially I'm not going to read the original article, but she's clapping back to an author who said that war is bad for the economy because you're essentially taking wealth and blowing it up. And you could use that to build a road or a bridge that saves people time on their commute. He writes about how it's just a transfer essentially of wealth from taxpayers to the military industrial complex.
Correct.
And yes. Megan says, is this true? In principle, Will is broadly right. The shift to a wartime economy represents a transfer of resources from consumer production to extremely non-durable, fun-for-no-one goods like grenades and tanks, and extremely ugly clothing made of mottled green and doppled taupe fabric. When I say fun for no one, I am of course leaving out the 19-year-olds who get to blow up things. I am assuming that this net psychic wealth is pretty much completely counterbalanced in a cosmic sense by the extreme non-fun having of the people who own or occupy the things that are exploded. Yikes. Not to mention the mental anguish of those 19-year-olds face at the prospect of eating MREs, forsaking indoor plumbing, wearing hot, uncomfortable clothing in the desert.
I like the thought that the worst thing a recruit can have is eating bad food and not like killing someone or tinnitus or getting injured or some shit.
Or getting a fucking limb blown off, yeah.
No, it's wearing unfashionable clothes. That's the real cost of the war.
I want to see the Megan Mgriddle review of Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, which is about how the military dehumanizes you into a killing machine. And the emotional climax of the movie is when the main character needs to shoot a child soldier in the head. And as they walk back to base, he's so desensitized that he's singing the theme to the Mickey Mouse song. I think Megan Mgriddle would watch that movie and be like, wow, he sure did self-actualize. He had a lot of fun in that war. He got to blow things up and shoot guns, which is what 19-year-old boys like to do.
So this is her continuing. However, economically, this transaction is fairly neutral. Economics, because it is not in the business of making moral judgments, regards the transfer of resources from, say, inventing Webvan to inventing a smart missile that targets people who have not separated their plastic recyclables from the rest of their garbage as making little difference to the overall size of the economy. Will seems to be implying that Lockheed takes the money and lights up a big bonfire outside of their corporate headquarters. But this money stays in the economy. Lockheed must also employ computer programmers who buy farm goods and insurance. I love that. What are public funds going to be used for if we're not invading Iraq? Oh, we're going to build a smart missile that targets people who aren't separating the recycling. That's what a libertarian imagines the alternative for spending money on a war. McMegan taking a brave anti-recycling stance.
Sorry, it just occurred to me. It's like, you're not looking at the knock-on effect of the Lockheed Martin employees going shopping. Can we cut out the fucking middleman then? Can we just have a universal basic income? They'll still go shopping, and we don't need to make bombs for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thesis of this article, is that it doesn't matter if you're building a hospital or you're giving the money directly to Lockheed Martin. The effect is the same, because whoever's getting the money is going to go shopping.
Guess what? It grows the economy. Benefits everybody. Hurts nobody.
Megan completely ignores the concept of a cost-benefit analysis. So if you spend the money on building a hospital or a public transportation system, you get the benefit of adding years to people's lives, taking time off their commute, reducing pollution, in addition to all the wages that the people who built it received. So not only do you get the same effect that you would give from Lockheed Martin getting money, but you also get the added effect of the thing that you built with the money and didn't just blow up. Back to McMegan.
Nonetheless, when an economy is already working at full equilibrium capacity, war is likely to shrink the economy by redirecting its resources to inefficient and, because much of what gets produced gets blown up, extremely wasteful uses. So this is her saying that the war is going to be good for the economy because World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. So she says in 1939, the unemployment rate for the civilian labor force was 17.9%. Let's think about that. We've got our knickers in a twist because unemployment might top 6%. Their unemployment rate was 3 times that, and a huge improvement from the 25% rate in 1933. Most production was far more labor intensive back then than it is now. In other words, there was a huge reservoir surplus capacity in the United States. And the reason there was a reservoir surplus capacity was that consumer demand was extremely depressed.
So she should be a fucking Keynesian, man. If she's like, if she literally brings up how high it was in 33 and how it was lower in 39. She should support like making the fucking national parks happen in the Tennessee Valley Authority, right?
Oh, well, it's interesting you bring that up because she does say that her answer to anybody who thinks that, oh, well, if consumer demand is depressed, shouldn't we just spend this on things that improve our lives? But she defends that position by saying that an interesting side note to this is that Japan has essentially tried to do the same thing with massive government works projects. They didn't work so good in the New Deal, and they aren't working so good in Japan. What's the difference? Well, one argument is that the massive debt required to finance the government works projects makes people so anxious about the future that any positive effect of the spending is effectively neutralized by the negative effect of the financing, which is a strange twist on the neoclassical model. In this view, only total war can sufficiently alter the economy to break the cycle. So you can't spend that money on dams because essentially you've cucked yourself by doing that.
The vibes are so bad. Megan coming out with an interesting thesis. The hikikomori in Japan are the product of anxiety about the national debt. That's why they stay in their homes like hermits and fuck the pillows or whatever.
Yeah, so her argument is that the government needs to spend money to make up for this drag in consumer demand, but you can't do it on public works projects because you're so anxious about the money that you're spending that you have to go to war because that's the only thing that essentially makes you not anxious about spending money.
Yeah, how does that work? How does war make you less anxious?
This is Megan again. Well, it's certainly not the Great Depression. A total war is not required to snap us out of the current doldrums. But then Iraq wouldn't be a total war either. If we assume that our natural rate of unemployment is currently a little over 4%, so while the war will probably be wasteful, I will doubt it will have as much of an effect one way or the other. It might give us a small boost. It might give us a small decline. It might do nothing noticeable either way. The crystal ball is cloudy. Then there's the fact that the decision to invade another country should rest on something more important than whether or not we think it can boost our national income by doing so.
Oh, should it? Should it?
What the fuck is the point of this article?
Todd's go in, Todd's come out. Can't explain that.
The whole point of this article to Megan is that World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. But that works because it was a big war and it was a big recession. But we're currently in a small recession, so what we need is a small war. We can have a little war as a treat.
She had recently seen the iconic Y2K meme, Icon has cheeseburger, and it really informed her foreign policy take. Just fucking psychotic goblin shit. At no point has she mentioned the potential Iraqi death toll. She knows implicitly the asymmetry of what is about to go down, right? She's not terribly worried about American casualties in this thing, but she doesn't even bother thinking about the casualty rate in Iraq.
Yeah, how much is it going to cost? Is it going to be good for the economy because it's going to boost our national psyche by killing people?
Yeah, some real, a horrifying picture into her mind.
I have a couple more articles. I'll read like the first sentence of this one. The administration is saying that they have proof that Iraq has links to Al-Qaeda. More and more, I'm beginning to believe that the administration...
You know who else has links to Al-Qaeda? The fucking CIA.
And the Saudis, just putting it out there, like how many of the hijackers were Saudi? Just asking questions.
Our good friends and allies in Pakistan has some pretty tight Al-Qaeda connections. Everyone should also read The Management of Savagery by Max Blumenthal. It's a book recommendation heavy episode. You can be as unhappy as we are.
Yeah, I mean, in this article, she's basically saying that Bush is playing 4D chess because the administration has the information that links Al-Qaeda to Iraq, but they're not releasing it. They're waiting until all the journalists come out and say that there is no connection before releasing it later, which is just like fan fiction for Megan Mcardle to be speculating that Bush has all this information that he's waiting for people to screw themselves over with.
Yeah, when I think of guys who play 4D chess, it's the guy who traded away Sammy Sosa. He's really thinking about the long game.
Just to round out Megan's take, she wrote an article a year after the war started saying, question of the day, will violence get better or worse or stay the same as the war goes on? I'm betting that it gets better. I think that the reason it gets better is because the terrorists seem so gosh darn determined to derail the handover. It seems likely to me that this is an all-out push against the Americans for strategic as well as fundraising and recruitment reasons that cannot indefinitely be sustained. Her take here is that there's so much resistance to the U.S. in Iraq right now that it's a sign of desperation. they're trying so hard because it's all they have left and it's not sustainable.
The night is darkest before the dawn.
The fact that she would undermine anybody else's credentials or say that they're unsourced or not rooted in fact, and then come out with a take, oh, this insurgency is going to wind down soon. This is something she wrote in 2004, because the intensity of their attacks is a sign that they're desperate and weak.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's awful. And it's why I hate libertarians, is that libertarians are just normal conservatives who like weed. That's it. That's the only difference between them. The same motherfuckers who tell you, they'll quote Ronald Reagan. They'll be like, scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Supporting the military. In that hypothetical, the government that they're scared of is like fucking DMV clerks or some shit. But this military industrial complex, fine with the libertarians, right? Fine burning all that money.
I do have one more quote from Megan here, in which she just takes the mask off. We're in the Middle East because stable oil prices are, economically speaking, very, very important. This is why the U.S. will not, for the foreseeable future, stop throwing its military might around the Middle East, whatever the romantic ideations of the pacifist left and the isolationist right. This is her just straight up, after all this debate about if it's going to be good for the economy because we'll be able to get our dicks hard, her just saying like, it would be impossible for us to not invade the Middle East because we need stable oil prices. Just say that. If that's how you feel, don't get into this long argument about how we're going to get a great deal and it's actually going to grow the economy.